welcome back to Fundamental Questions in Judaism, Fundamental Conversations. Today we're continuing what we've discussed in previous conversations and classes, God. In previous classes we discussed God revelation versus God himself. We discussed where God is God eminent to the world, or is it God above the world? Today we're going to discuss the names of God and the names we call God, describe God. In the Torah itself, God has a few names. You have Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, Shem Havaya, and the second main name is Elokim. But there are other names to God. You have El Shaddai, you have Tzvakot, Ezkel, and that's before the nicknames to God. Rachum, Chanun, Echapayim. Those are names where we describe God's attributes. So the question is, what's the distinction, and what does it mean, God's name, various names, and what does it mean, the different attributes that we attribute to God? So we'll start with God's names. God's names, mainly the two most prominent names of Yud-Kei Vav-Kei and Elokim, represent different things according to different commentaries. These, while some of them contradict, others don't. We'll start with Chazal. In Chazal themselves, we can attribute the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei to God's Midat HaRachamim, Chesed, while Elokim is attributed to God Midat Adin, meaning we notice that God runs the world in various ways, while idol worshippers believe in various sources to the various experiences in the world. The good comes from the good God, and the bad comes from the bad gods, and every force of nature had a different source. Judaism believes in one source to all. But there are many times contradicting experiences of din, of justice, of harshness, where the world is judged, and experiences where we feel God's mercy and love. The two names of God, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei versus Elokim, represent those two ways where God reveals himself in the world, or more precisely, the way God runs the world. Does he run it with mercy? Does he rule it with mercy? Or does he rule it with judgment? The Midrash tells us that God wanted to create the world bedin, b'midat adin, Elokim, saw the world didn't exist, and therefore added Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the Rachamim, in order to allow the world to exist. But these two attributes of Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, Rachamim, Slash Chesed, and Elokim, which represents Midat Adin, they describe the different various ways where God governs the world we live in. And therefore, throughout the Tanakh, not only in the Torah, but throughout the Tanakh, many times commentaries learn from this usage of the name, is it Yud-Kei Vav-Kei or Elokim, what kind of ruling is it? What kind of hanhaga, what kind of rulership is being used by God? Is God judging the world with Midat Adin now, or is he using his mercy? That's Yud-Kei Vav-Kei and Elokim. There are other names of God represent various ideas as well. Shaddai, the Gemara says, Shamar L'olam Dai, God's ability to limit reality. Tzvakot, God's infinity, the fact that God is infinite and therefore rules all forces of nature, all forces, all angels, all the stars, all the infinite reality that we see around us, all come on together. They all stem from God. It's Tzvakot. And Kel, which means powerful, right? Source of power. God is just a source of many powerful, all sources of power stem from God. So each of these names represent a revelation, a human experience of God, either we experience God's mercy, God's judgment through Elokim, God's infinitely through Tzvakot, God's ability to limit reality in Shaddai, and God's power in Shem Kel. What about the attributes? God is always, many times called the merciful, the strong, the great. We use these attributes many times during the tefillah, praising God. Is God truly merciful? Is he wise? Are these the correct attributes we can attribute to him? The Rambam famously says no. He says God is infinite and God is beyond those concepts. These are all human concepts. These words, these attributes, these names were given by man in order to better understand certain concepts regarding God. For example, we call God wise, for we understand that he is all-knowing. Because someone who is wise, for humans, is someone who knows a lot. So we say God is wise. But God's wisdom is different than man's wisdom. We say God is strong, right? Then we mean strong, we mean to emphasize that he's not weak. He's not lacking power. But his strength is different than human strength. It doesn't have muscle. God's power is infinite. That's beyond our comprehension. God, is, according to many, is immanent to the world. And therefore, doesn't need strength, for he is bringing the world into creation. Yet we use the word strong, for we'll understand that God is not weak. God is all capable. Similarly, when we say God is merciful, that God does not have emotions same as human beings do. Human beings are affected. We see someone in distress, our heart beats harder, we feel uncomfortable, and therefore we act to remove that discomfort because we have empathy with them. God does not have a physical form, and therefore does not affect it. His emotions are different. We talk about his emotions as though he has them, but it's only to help us understand how he runs the world. He runs the world as though a man would if he had the emotion of mercy. Similarly, says the Rambam, these emotions are meant to teach us how God expects us to behave. God commands us to follow God's footsteps, and therefore all this, the various ways God is described, his attributes, are there to teach us how we should behave, what attributes we should adopt to ourselves. But not that God himself possesses these attributes. Rather, God acts many times as though he has those attributes, and God expects us to behave according to those attributes, to acquire those attributes to ourselves. But not that God himself is an emotional entity that has mercy or anger, or many times God is angry. God loses his temper. Rather, God behaves and as we should behave in such a as a human being would behave in such a situation. And therefore it's described as anger. Or seemingly is trying to explain to us that God is not happy with this behavior, and therefore God is upset. Because when we're upset, that means we're not satisfied or happy with the outcome or the event that just took place. So this understanding is a bit confusing because it makes us, every time we talk about God, we're not talking about God himself. It's all from man's perspective. How man experiences God, or how man should learn, what man should learn from God. It's never talking about God himself. Again, as described in the first class of this series, God himself is beyond man's comprehension, and therefore we just could have ended the class then. But yet, since we decided to talk about God from man's perspective, then we can have these series of classes, because there is a lot to learn from how we as human beings experience God, experience his judgment, experience the way he runs the world, the way he treats us, and the way he wants us to treat others. That is regarding God's names and God's attributes. This leads to the famous question that everyone loves to ask, and that is, can God create a rock that he can't lift up? This is called a paradox, because if you answer by saying, no, God cannot, that means that God is not limitless. And God being infinite, supposedly you're able to do anything, but you just said that God cannot do something, and therefore he's not God, because God by definition is something with infinite power and ability. Now if you answer yes, that means God created something that's more powerful than him, and therefore again, he's not God, because God is supposed to be the most powerful entity. Yet there's something that's more powerful than him, preventing him from lifting the rock. So how do you resolve that paradox? Many have tried to answer this paradox over the ages. We're going to give three of the most common answers. The first answer is that the question makes no sense. The question in itself is a paradox, because just like you can't say, can a circle be square, or can a triangle be a circle, that's a meaningless question, because a triangle is a definition of something. And by asking, can a definition of something be the same as a different definition at the same time, is just wrong. A circle cannot be a circle and a square at the same time. Therefore, God, which is infinite, cannot be limited at the same time, because the question makes no sense. It's just like asking, can a circle be a square? It's not can be. A circle is not a square. Can God be not infinite? God is infinite. So you can't ask, can he? Because that won't be describing God. The second answer brought dafka from the Mekubalim is, surprisingly, yes. If we discussed in the previous question, we discussed the idea of tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is where God has the ability to limit himself. And can God limit himself? The answer is yes. We saw this in the class regarding free will, that according to many, man's ability to possess free will stems from the fact that God limited his knowledge and his ability to know what man would choose, to allow free will. So can God, just like God limited himself to allow free will, just like he limited his infinity, being infinite, to allow the world to exist, can God limit himself, his infinite power, to allow a creation of a rock that he can't pick up? Can he limit himself in that way? They say yes. If God wants to, he can limit himself. When we talk about God limiting himself, we explained in the previous class, we're talking from man's perspective. That from man's perspective, God can limit himself. But from God's perspective, of course, God will always remain infinite. So those are two approaches. At first approach, the answer is no, because the question is just ridiculous. The second answer is yes, God has the ability to limit himself. The third answer comes and says the answer can either be yes or no, because as explained, if God is eminent, then both the rock and the creator are both God. So can God create a rock that he cannot lift up? You can say yes, because that rock that he created would be he himself, eminently creating that rock every moment. And the answer is no, also be true, because God is the creator as well. So according to this, the answer can be either yes or no, seeing as the question assumes that the creation is separate from the creator. But if the approach of eminency, that God is part of creation, the creation is a revelation of God, then God can God create a revelation that he chooses not to pick up? Yeah. But that revelation in itself would also be God, just like the creator itself. So therefore, the answer is meaningless, just as, not paradoxical, but just meaningless. The answer can either be yes or no. So that is regarding the attributes we attribute to God, wisdom, strength, and even the attribute of being infinite. We see that led to the paradox of the rock, how the idea of God being immanent versus being transcendent from the world, how that affects that answer. In the next class, we'll start discussing the proofs for the existence of God.